Erev Tov Rabotai, we're continuing with our Mishna Yomi Masechet Maasrot. We're up to Perek Gimel Mishnah Tet. Today's Mishnayot should be Nishmat Neria ben Svetlana Aranbai and Eliyahu ben Burcha Israelov Menuchatam Began Eden. Amen. In yesterday's Mishnah we learned that when figs grow in a courtyard they can be eaten as a snack only when they have not been combined, meaning when no more than one fig was picked and eaten at one time. The Mishnah today is going to discuss how do you apply this rule to items that are usually divided into smaller pieces before they are eaten, so that even when one unit is picked, it could be like it's considered several pieces combined. The Mishnah says, Gefen shin nituah bechatzer. If a grapevine is planted in a courtyard, notel et kol ha'eshkol, he may take a whole cluster of grapes from the vine and eat it without separating Maasrot. Even though a cluster has many grapes on it, we view the entire cluster as one unit and not as a combination of many individual grapes. V'chen berimon, v'chen ba'avatiach. The same is true for a pomegranate that grows in the courtyard, and the same is true for a melon that grows in the courtyard. Although a pomegranate consists of many individual seeds, and a melon consists of many pieces, because the Mefarshim explain a melon is usually sliced into several pieces before being eaten, so a whole melon could technically be viewed as a collection of several pieces. Nevertheless, a whole pomegranate and a whole melon may be picked and eaten without separating Maasrot. Divrei Rabbi Talfon, these are the words of Rabbi Talfon, because the Mefarshim explain Rabbi Talfon considers a whole cluster of grapes, a pomegranate or a melon, a single unit, even though it will eventually be broken up into smaller units. Therefore, picking an entire fruit or cluster is not considered combining fruits, but simply picking one fruit which you can snack on before separating Maasrot. Rabbi Akiva Omer, but Rabbi Akiva says, Megarger be'eshkolot uporet barimon v'sofet ba'avatiach. If he wishes to eat from these fruits without separating Maasrot, he must pick one grape at a time from the cluster while it's still attached to the vine, pick out one seed at a time from the pomegranate while it's still attached to the tree, and cut off one thin slice at a time from the melon while it is still attached to the ground. Because since these items are usually divided into pieces before they are eaten, Rabbi Akiva considers removing an entire cluster or a whole pomegranate or melon to be combining two or more fruits. That would make them subject to the maaser obligation and prohibits eating them as a snack until their maaser has been separated. And the Mefarshim explain, we learned a similar halakha earlier in chapter 2, Mishnah 6, in regards to selling a cluster of grapes, a whole pomegranate or melon. Over there we learned that a buyer may snack on them without separating maaser only if he takes one grape or seed or slice from the fruit while it's still attached. There, however, the Mishnah does not say that Rabbi Talfon disagrees and permits eating the whole cluster of fruit. So the Mefarshim say it seems from this that Rabbi Talfon agrees in that case of selling that it's asur. That's because selling has a greater power to set the maaser obligation than being brought into a courtyard. When it comes to selling, even Rabbi Talfon agrees that a cluster or a pomegranate or a melon is treated as a combination of fruits and not as a single unit. But in any event, the Rav tells us, Rabbi Akiva, the halakha follows Rabbi Akiva, that we consider it to be many different pieces combined, and therefore you would have to pick one grape at a time from the cluster, pick out one seed at a time from the pomegranate, and cut off one thin slice at a time from the melon while they are still attached to the tree, the vineyard, and the ground, respectively. Now the Mefarshim explain the rule that combining two or more items in a courtyard makes them forbidden to be eaten is applied to the leaves of a coriander plant. The Mefarshim say, just to point out, Maasrot are not usually separated from coriander leaves because coriander is generally grown from the spice that is made from its seeds, not from its leaves. We'll speak about this B'ezrat Hashem in chapter 4, Mishnah 5. Our Mishnah is speaking about a case where coriander was planted with the specific intention of using its leaves. That's just what the Mefarshim point out. We're going to get into it again, B'ezrat Hashem, later on. Kuzbar shizua bechatzer. If coriander is planted in a courtyard, mikartem ale ve'ochel. He may cut off one leaf at a time and eat it without separating Maasrot. V'im tzerav chayav. But if he combined 2 or more leaves, he's obligated to separate Maasrot before he snacks on them. The Mishnah is teaching us that even though coriander leaves are not the main part of the plant, if he used them and combined them, they become set for Maasrot, because again, the Mishnah is speaking about where coriander was planted with the specific intention of using its leaves. The Mishnah now discusses the Maaser obligation of several other types of produce that grow in a courtyard. Ha'isa, va'ezov, va'kunit, shebechatzer. If savory, hyssop, and oregano are growing in a courtyard, the Mefarshim say this is based off the translations of the Aruch. Im hayu nishmarim chayavim. If they were being protected by the owner, meaning that he's careful that they not be taken by anybody else, they are subject to the Maaser obligation, because since these plants grow wild without being planted, they are often left unprotected by the owner, and we know unprotected produce is not subject to the Maaser obligation, like we learned in chapter 1, Mishnah 1, and therefore, unless the owner makes a point of protecting them, they are not subject to the Maaser obligations. And that is in Rabotai of Mishnah Tet. Mishnah Yud now is continuing what we learned in Mishnah Chet, that when a fig tree grows in a courtyard, the owner cannot combine 2 figs and eat them as a snack. The Mishnah now is going to discuss the Maaser rule for a tree that is partially inside the courtyard and partially outside of it. So in connection with this, the Mishnah is going to discuss the rule for such a tree in regards to other Torah laws. That's why the Mishnah is a little bit long. Te'ena she'omedet bechatzer v'noteh legina. If a fig tree stands inside a courtyard and one of its branches leans over into a garden outside the courtyard, meaning one of its branches extends outside the courtyard into the garden, ochel kedako patur. He may stand in the garden and eat figs growing over it in his usual manner, meaning even 2 or more figs at a time, and he's not obligated to separate Maasrot before eating them as a snack, because since these figs didn't enter the courtyard and he's standing in the garden, they did not become subject to Maasrot when he picked them. Omedet bagina v'nota lechatzer. If the tree stands in the garden and leans over into the courtyard, so that some of the figs hang over the courtyard, ochel achat achat patur. He may pick those figs and eat them one at a time without being obligated to separate Maasrot from them. V'im tzarav chayav. But if he combined 2 or more figs, he's obligated to separate Maasrot before eating them as a snack, because since these figs are in the courtyard, they become subject to Maasrot as soon as they're picked and combined. And the Mefarshim explain, fruit does not become subject to Maasrot until it's picked, and once it's picked, it's no longer part of the tree. Therefore, the location of the tree is not important to the Maaser status of the fruit. The only factor to consider is where the figs are when they are picked. In the first case, where it's standing in a courtyard and it's leaning over the garden, and you take it in the garden, then the status is you're in a garden, you can eat as many as you want. But if it's in the garden and leans over to the courtyard, the status is when you pick it in the courtyard, you can only eat one without separating. But if you combine, you're obligated to separate. The Mishnah now is going to discuss other halachot that apply to a tree that stands in one area and leans into another. The first case involves a tree that is partially in Eretz Yisrael, where fruit is subject to Maasrot, and partially outside of Eretz Yisrael, where the laws of Maasrot do not apply, except midrabanan by rabbinic law in certain places. Omedet ba'aretz v'nota lechutz ha'aretz. If a tree stands inside the land of Israel and one of its branches extends outside the land of Israel, b'chutz ha'aretz v'nota la'aretz, or if it stands outside the land and one of its branches leans into the land, hakol olech achar ha'ikar. Everything goes by the location of the tree's trunk. If the tree's trunk is inside the land of Israel, all of its fruit is considered to have grown in the land of Israel, and if the tree's trunk is outside the land of Israel, all of its fruit is considered to have grown outside. Since the tree's nourishment, the Mefarshim say, is drawn from the ground by its trunk, the entire tree is considered to be located where its trunk is. And that is how the Rav explains it. The next halakha, now the Mefarshim explain as an introduction, is about houses inside a walled city in the land of Israel. We know the Mishnah tells us in Masechet Arachin, chapter 9, Mishnah 6, that in the ancient world, large cities were surrounded by walls for protection. The Mishnah speaks of cities that were surrounded by walls from the time the Jews first entered the land in the days of Yeshua. Such cities were subject to special halachot. So the Torah teaches that when a house inside a walled city is sold, the seller has the right to buy it back for a period of 1 year after the sale. Once that year passes, he can no longer force the buyer to sell it back to him. This we learn in Sefer Vayikra, chapter 25, Psukim 29 to 34, and Masechet Arachin, Mishnayot, chapter 9, Mishnah 3 and 4. Nor the Mefarshim say, nor does the house return to the seller at Yovel. But by contrast, when a house that is not in a walled city is sold, the seller has the right to buy it back at any time, both during and after the first year. Additionally, even if he doesn't buy it back, the house returns to him at Yovel. Again, in Masechet Erachin, chapter 9, Mishnah 7, we'll speak about it more. Now the Mefarshim say a tree inside a walled city is subject to the same rule. The Mishnah now is going to teach the halacha for a tree that is partially inside a walled city and partially outside of a walled city. And similarly, with regards to the law of houses in the walled cities, everything goes by the location of the tree's trunk. Meaning, if the tree's trunk is within the city's walls, the entire tree is considered to be within the walled city, and even the branches hanging outside can only be bought back for the first year, as the Rav explains. If the tree's trunk is outside the city's walls, the entire tree is considered to be outside the walled city, and even the branches hanging inside may be bought back at any time, because again, since the entire tree is nourished through the trunk, all of it is considered to be wherever the trunk is. The next part of the Mishnah now is going to deal with the laws of an Ir Miklat, which is a city of refuge. The Torah says that someone who unintentionally kills another person goes into exile in an Ir Miklat, where he's protected from the revenge of the victim's relatives. However, if he steps out of the city, the relatives may kill him. This we learn in Sefer Bamidbar, chapter 35, Psukim 9 to 29, in Sefer Dvarim, chapter 19, Psukim 1 to 10. In regards to this halacha, an area of 2,000 amot around the city is considered part of the city. That area is known as the Tichum of the city. The Mishnah teaches the halacha for a tree that is partially within 2,000 amot of the city and partially outside of it. With regards to Arei Miklat, everything goes by the location of the branches as well, in contrast to what we were saying until now. If either the tree's trunk or its branches are within 2,000 amot of the Ir Miklat, the entire tree is treated as if it's within that area, and therefore it is forbidden for the victim's relative to attack the killer if he is under any part of the tree that is partially within 2,000 amot of the Ir Miklat. In a case where the trunk is inside the city's Tichum and the branches are outside, we follow the general rule that branches of a tree are considered to be where the trunk is. Since the trunk is in a protected area, the area under the branches is also protected. When the trunk is outside and the branches are inside, the Rav says a person standing under the branches is surely protected since he is inside the city boundaries. However, the rabbis extended the protection to the area of the trunk itself as well. The Mishnah's final ruling now is about the laws of Maaser Sheni, the second tithe. Maaser Sheni has to be taken to Yerushalayim and eaten there. If it's difficult, you can instead redeem it for money. The money is then taken to Yerushalayim, where it's spent on food and eaten there. Maaser Sheni may not be eaten outside of Yerushalayim, and it may not be redeemed for money inside Yerushalayim. Therefore, classifying an area as being inside Yerushalayim or outside of it leads to both a stringency and a leniency. If it's inside Yerushalayim, he may eat his Maaser Sheni there, but he may no longer redeem it. If it's outside Yerushalayim, he may not eat his Maaser Sheni there, but he may still redeem it. So Mishnah now is going to discuss the status of a tree that is partly in Yerushalayim and partly outside of it. And similarly, with regards to Yerushalayim and Maaser Sheni, everything goes by the location of the branches as well. If part of the tree is inside the city and part of it outside, we treat the entire tree according to the stricter position. Maaser Sheni may not be eaten at either part of the tree, as if it's all outside of the city, nor may it be redeemed at either part as well, as if it's inside, as if it is all inside the city. It makes no difference which part of the tree was inside the city and which part was outside. We're going to be strict in both situations. We're not going to redeem money in any part of the tree, and we're not going to eat the Maaser Sheni in any part of the tree as well if the branch is in one area and the trunk is in a different, or if the trunk is in one area and the branch is in a different. That is in Rabotai of today's Mishnah Yomi. That is the end of Perek Gimel Mishnah Yud and the entire Perek as well. Tomorrow we begin with Perek Dal Bezrat Hashem Bli Neder. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen v'amen.